Ethan Reyes stood outside the building holding everything he had left. A coffee mug, a phone charger, and a photo of his daughter taped inside a folder. 20 minutes ago, they'd fired him in front of the whole office. No warning, no real reason. Just a signature on a page and a security guard watching him pack. His daughter Lily was waiting at daycare, and he had $11 in his account. He pulled out his phone, scrolled to a number he hadn't called in 3 years, and pressed dial. The voice on the other end already knew who he was. Ethan said 4 words, calm and quiet. Fire every one of them. What none of them knew yet was who he really was, and it was about to destroy everything they thought they'd won. The line had gone quiet after he said it. Not stunned quiet, prepared quiet. Like the man on the other end had been waiting 3 weeks for exactly this call. Understood, the voice said. Legal hold goes in within the hour. Board's already been notified something was coming. Ethan looked up at the glass doors of Whitman and Cole one last time. Somewhere behind them, 12 floors up, Diane Foster was probably still smiling. Good, he said. I'll be in touch. He ended the call, picked up the box, and walked toward his car without looking back. He sat behind the wheel for a long moment before starting the engine. The box sat on the passenger seat, untouched. He wasn't ready to look inside it yet. Not the folder, not the photo of Lily taped to the inside cover that he glanced at every single morning before opening his laptop. A small ritual that made the gray cubicle feel a little less gray. 2 hours later, he parked outside her daycare. 3:15, same as every day. Except today, everything behind him had quietly come apart, and she had no idea. The doors burst open, releasing a wave of small bodies, backpacks bouncing, sneakers slapping the pavement. Lily found him instantly, the way she always did, like she had some internal compass built just for him. Daddy! She sprinted the last few feet and crashed into his arms. Hey, Bug! He lifted her half off the ground, and for one brief second, the weight in his chest actually lifted too. How was school? Ms. Ferris said my solar system drawing was the best one, she said, already digging through her backpack. Except I made Saturn's rings too big. It looked like a hat. He laughed, a real laugh, the first one all day. I bet it looked amazing. Can I show you when we get home? Where's your work bag? His smile faltered for half a second before he caught it. Left it at the office, Bug. Come on, let's get you buckled in. She didn't notice. Kids rarely notice the things adults spend all their energy hiding. She climbed into her booster seat, chattering about Saturn and a boy named Marcus who'd eaten paste at lunch, and Ethan pulled out of the lot with his hands steady on the wheel and his mind somewhere else entirely. 12 floors up in a glass office, where a woman was about to find out exactly what she'd done. He'd taken the job at Whitman and Cole 3 weeks earlier under a name that meant nothing to anyone in that building. Ethan Reyes, entry-level data associate, recently back from overseas contract work. That part at least was true. He'd spent 2 years abroad in logistics consulting, learning how companies actually functioned from the ground up, long before his father ever called and said it was time to come home. His father, Walter Whitman. 72, founder of a logistics empire that had grown from 3 delivery trucks into one of the largest privately held companies on the East Coast. A man who'd built something enormous and had spent the last 2 years quietly terrified that somewhere along the way, it had started rotting from the inside without him noticing. Walter had one condition for whoever eventually took his seat. They had to understand the company from the bottom, not the top. Ethan agreed without hesitation. It matched the only kind of leadership he actually believed in. The kind built from paying attention, not from a title. There was a second reason Ethan had said yes, one he hadn't told his father. Since his wife passed 2 years ago, it had just been him and Lily. Daycare bills, a mortgage he was barely keeping up with. A life that looked fine from the outside and felt like a tightrope from the inside. He needed to know he could still build something with his own 2 hands, not inherit it, not be handed it because of his last name. He needed Lily to grow up knowing her father earned what they had. So he showed up that first Monday in plain trousers and a button-down, introduced himself to HR as a new associate on temporary assignment, and got assigned to the 14th floor, mid-level operations, data entry, vendor reports, the unglamorous connective tissue of the company. If something was wrong with the culture at Whit Cole, Walter had told him, it would show up there first. His supervisor was Diane Foster, mid-40s, sharp-eyed, the kind of woman who'd learned exactly how little effort was required to maintain authority once she'd held it long enough. On his first day, she looked him over once and handed him a stack of overdue compliance reports without asking his name. He didn't complain, he just worked. By the end of his first week, he'd quietly finished work that had been split between 4 people. He hadn't announced it. He just uploaded clean, finished reports to the shared drive and moved on to the next task. 2 days later, he overheard Diane's second-in-command, a loud, easy-smiling man named Chris Mallory, taking credit for a vendor report Ethan had spent 11 hours rebuilding from scratch. Diane nodded approvingly. Chris got CC'd on the follow-up email to leadership. Ethan's name appeared nowhere. He wasn't surprised. He was watching. That evening, after mac and cheese and a bath and 3 chapters of a book about a dog who could talk to spiders, Ethan sat on the edge of Lily's bed while she fought sleep the way she always did. One more question, one more stall. "Daddy? Yeah, Bug? Are we gonna be okay?" He froze for half a second. She'd never asked him that before. Not once. Not even in the hardest months after her mom died. "Course we are," he said, keeping his voice light. "Why would you ask that? You seemed sad in the car when I asked about your work bag." He looked at her for a long moment. This small, sharp, impossibly perceptive person who somehow always knew when something was wrong before he'd said a word. "I had a hard day at work," he admitted, "but I promise you everything is going to be okay. Better than okay." She studied his face the way only a child can, searching, unguarded, deciding whether to believe him. "Pinky promise?" she said, holding up her hand. He hooked his pinky around hers. "Pinky promise." She smiled, satisfied, and rolled over, asleep within minutes the way only kids can manage. Ethan sat there in the dark a long while after, thinking about the box still sitting in his trunk, thinking about the 4 words he'd said outside that building, thinking about the fact that in less than 24 hours, everyone at Whitman and Cole was going to learn something about him that would change everything, including how his daughter saw him. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, a text from the same number he'd called that afternoon. "Board convened. Full audit under legal hold. Your father wants you at the office. 6 a.m. Ethan stared at the screen for a long moment. Tomorrow he wasn't walking back into that building as Ethan Reyes, entry-level data associate. Tomorrow everyone was going to find out exactly who had been sitting on the 14th floor for 3 weeks, and exactly what he was capable of. The pattern at Whitman and Cole repeated itself with almost mechanical precision over Ethan's first 2 weeks. Any project that turned out well got claimed by someone above him. Any mistake, even ones he had nothing to do with, found its way back to his desk with his name attached before Diane ever saw it. There was an unspoken hierarchy to who absorbed the blame, and Ethan, as the newest and least connected person on the floor, sat at the bottom of it. He didn't fight it. Not yet. He simply watched and remembered. There was a woman on the floor named Priya Sharma, a compliance analyst in her early 30s, who'd been with the company almost 6 years. She was quiet, meticulous, the kind of person who triple-checked her own work out of habit rather than fear. One Tuesday afternoon, she made a small formatting error in a regulatory filing, the kind of mistake that took 90 seconds to fix. Diane called it out in the middle of the open floor, loud enough for the whole department to hear, her voice sharpened with the specific cruelty of someone who enjoyed an audience. Priya didn't argue. She said, "Yes, I'll fix it right away," her face perfectly still, and went back to her screen. But Ethan, sitting 2 desks away, watched her hands. They trembled slightly over the keyboard for almost a full minute before she managed to type again. He filed that moment away with everything else. It wasn't really about the formatting error. It never was. That same week, Ethan started noticing the smaller cruelties too, the ones that never made it into any complaint because they were too small individually to matter. Lunch invitations mentioned just loud enough for him to hear, then quietly finalized without him. Questions in meetings that weren't really questions, just traps designed to expose a gap in his knowledge so it could be repeated later as evidence of incompetence. Assignments dropped on his desk at 4:50 in the afternoon, due the next morning, always vague enough that failure was almost guaranteed, and always convenient enough to be used against him later. None of it, on its own, was enough to complain about. That was the design. That was always the design. At night after Lily was asleep, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and quietly built something Diane Foster had no idea existed. A timeline. Dates, screenshots, names, every reassigned credit, every misplaced blame, every small cruelty that Priya and the others on that floor absorbed and swallowed because speaking up had never once worked in their favor. He wasn't just gathering evidence for himself anymore. Somewhere around the second week, it had stopped being about his own situation entirely. Money had gotten tight before all of this even started, and it wasn't like Ethan had walked into Whitman and Cole from a place of comfort. The entry-level salary barely covered daycare and the mortgage combined. And more than once, that month he'd sat at the kitchen table doing math that never quite worked out, moving numbers around like puzzle pieces that refused to fit no matter how he arranged them. He could have told his father the truth anytime, could have asked for help. Walter would have handed him whatever he needed without a second thought. But every time Ethan thought about doing that, he thought about Lily and about the version of himself he wanted her to grow up watching. A father who built things, a father who earned what they had, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. So he kept going. He packed her lunch every morning, dropped her at daycare, worked a job that slowly chipped away at his patience and his dignity in equal measure, picked her up at 3:15, and pretended none of it weighed on him at all. It weighed on him constantly. Ethan was at his desk on the 32nd floor by 5:55 the next morning. The city outside the windows was still dark, the skyline just beginning to separate itself from the night sky. He hadn't slept more than 3 hours. He'd spent most of the night sitting at the kitchen table again, not building the timeline this time, just staring at it, thinking about Priya's hands shaking over her keyboard, thinking about Lily's small voice, asking if they were going to be okay. His father was already in the boardroom when Ethan walked in. Walter Whitman stood at the head of the long table rather than sitting, which was how Ethan knew the old man hadn't slept much either. He was dressed the way he always was. Dark suit, no tie, white hair combed close. A posture that had never quite let go of 30 years in the Marine Corps, even decades removed from it. When he saw his son walk through the door, something in his face shifted. Not quite relief, something close to it. "You look tired," Walter said. "I am," Ethan said. "It's been a long 3 weeks." General Counsel Martin Cole was already seated with two members of the legal team, folders open in front of them. Two board members appeared on the screen at the far end of the room, dialed in remotely, their faces lit with the pale glow of early morning video calls. And in the corner, seated with the stiff, careful posture of someone who understood her position in the room had changed overnight, was Sandra Pruitt, the HR director who had personally handed Ethan his termination notice less than 18 hours earlier. Walter didn't open with pleasantries. He confirmed the legal hold was already in place, that IT Security had launched a parallel audit of the data access logs, and that no one on the 14th floor had any idea anything had changed. As far as Diane Foster knew, she'd won. The floor was operating exactly as it had the day before. "Walk us through it," Walter said, looking at his son. Ethan didn't use notes. He didn't need them. He laid out 3 weeks of misappropriated work, of blame quietly redirected downward, of a woman named Priya Sharma humiliated in front of an entire floor over a 90-second mistake. He told them about the fabricated data breach, about being handed a document he wasn't allowed to examine, about signing a termination notice for a crime that had never happened. Sandra Pruitt sat perfectly still through all of it, her hand tightening slowly around the folder in front of her. "I want to be clear about something," Ethan said, looking directly at her now. "I don't think you built this. I think you were handed a document this morning and told to deliver it without being allowed to look underneath it. That's a different kind of problem, and we're going to need to have a separate conversation about it. But right now, I need to know. Did you know the audit trail was fabricated?" Sandra's throat moved as she swallowed. "No," she said quietly. "I asked to see it. I was told it wasn't available to me." Martin's team had already begun pulling the access logs by then, and within the first 30 minutes, the picture became unambiguous. The data extraction flagged under Ethan's credentials had originated from a machine he'd never once logged into. The IP address traced back to a workstation registered to Chris Mallory. Someone had used Ethan's login from Chris's desk. It wasn't sophisticated. It hadn't needed to be. Nobody on that floor had ever been seriously examined before, and whoever set it up had counted on that never changing. The framing is unambiguous, Martin said, setting the preliminary findings on the table. We'll need a few more hours to compile the full picture, but what we have now is more than sufficient to act. Walter looked at his son. How do you want to proceed? Exactly as planned, Ethan said. All hands meeting today. Evidence presented. No mention of who I am until we're standing in front of them. Walter nodded once and turned to Sandra. Prepare the company-wide notice. Say nothing beyond what it contains. The notice went out at 10 that morning. Brief, almost clinical. Founding chairman has an announcement regarding the company's future leadership. Mandatory attendance, main atrium, 4 p.m. By early afternoon, the building was humming with speculation. On the 14th floor, Diane held court near the window bank the way she always did when she sensed something important was happening and wanted to appear close to it. Transitions like this, she said to no one in particular, loud enough for several people to hear, are usually opportunities for people who've demonstrated real value to the organization. Chris laughed at that. Priya, 2 desks away, said nothing at all. She hadn't said much of anything since the day before, when word had quietly circulated that the new guy, Ethan, the quiet one who never took credit for anything, had been walked out by security. Nobody on that floor connected the 4 o'clock meeting to anything happening around them. Nobody noticed that Sandra Pruitt hadn't come back to her desk since morning. Ethan spent the hours before the meeting in his father's office, reading through the preliminary audit summary Martin's team had assembled. 12 pages. He read every line twice. What the record showed was worse than anything he'd personally witnessed. The manipulation stretched back nearly 4 years. Documented instances of Diane approving retaliatory reviews for employees who'd raised informal complaints about the floor's environment. 3 of those employees had eventually left the company. One had accepted a quiet settlement just to make the situation disappear. Credit theft ran through the records in a pattern too consistent to be accidental. Chris Mallory's name appeared attached to favorable project summaries at a rate that bore no real relationship to his actual contributions. A second lieutenant, a woman named Renee Park, appeared to have functioned as the administrative machinery behind it all, quietly rerouting paperwork in ways that made the misattribution almost impossible to trace without exactly this kind of audit. And above all of it sat Diane, approving, authorizing, occasionally directing, her fingerprints rarely on the surface, but everywhere in the structure underneath. Ethan closed the folder and sat with it for a long moment, thinking about the decision in front of him. Firing Diane, Chris, and Renee was straightforward. The evidence was specific and undeniable. But the audit had also flagged 4 other employees who'd participated at varying levels, some actively, some through a silence that had protected the scheme as effectively as if they had built it themselves. He thought about Priya's shaking hands. He thought about how much easier it would have been for her to simply say nothing, the way most of them had learned to. He thought about what kind of company he wanted his daughter to be proud of one day. At 4 p.m., the atrium was full. Ethan stood in a side corridor with Martin, watching the crowd through a narrow gap in the partition. Diane stood near the center of the room, with the easy confidence of someone expecting good news. Chris stood beside her. Priya was near the back, arms crossed, watching the empty stage with an expression that gave away nothing. Walter walked out at exactly 4 o'clock with the unhurried authority of a man who'd been doing this for 40 years. The room settled the moment he appeared. He thanked the company for its decades of work. He said that handing Whitman and Cole to the right person was the most important decision he had left to make in his life, and that the man taking that seat had spent the last 3 weeks inside this building already. Not in an office, but on the floor, doing the work, absorbing exactly what it felt like to be someone with no power in this company. My son, Walter said, has been walking among you for 3 weeks. Ethan, come up. Ethan stepped onto the platform. He was wearing the same plain trousers and button-down he'd been fired in less than 24 hours earlier. He carried nothing in his hands. The silence that fell over the room was total. The specific, disbelieving silence of several hundred people trying to process something that didn't fit into any category they'd prepared for. From the platform, Ethan watched Diane's face cycle through recognition, then calculation, then something with no clean name at all. He didn't deliver a speech. He introduced himself, briefly explained his father's reasoning, and said that the past 3 weeks had been the most instructive of his professional life, and that some of what he'd learned required immediate attention. Then he stepped aside and asked Martin to take the floor. Martin was precise, unhurried, and completely unshakable in the way lawyers get when they're standing on evidence they trust completely. He explained that in connection with a termination that had occurred the previous morning, legal had launched a review of the 14th floor's records, and that the review had already uncovered a fabricated data breach used to justify firing an employee without cause. He said the broader pattern the audit was revealing went back significantly further than one incident, and that several individuals connected to it had been placed on immediate administrative suspension pending the outcome. He named no one from the stage. The atrium didn't erupt. It went still in the specific way rooms go still when something serious enough is being said that people stop performing their reactions and simply absorb it. Diane's face had gone white. Chris wasn't laughing anymore. Ethan looked out over the crowd, found Priya near the back, and for one brief second, their eyes met. She didn't smile. She just gave the smallest possible nod, like something in her chest had finally, cautiously, allowed itself to loosen. After the meeting ended and the atrium began to clear, one of the legal team members handed Ethan a folder, the completed portion of the audit, ready sooner than expected. He stood there reading it while the last of the crowd filtered out around him, the noise of the building slowly returning to something normal. Then he reached a page near the back, a name he hadn't expected to see anywhere in this audit at all. He read it twice, certain he'd misunderstood it the first time. He hadn't. His phone buzzed in his pocket at the exact same moment. A text from an unknown number, sent less than 2 minutes ago. You have no idea what you just started. Ask your father what happened to the last person who tried to expose this floor. Then ask him why he never told you. Ethan stood frozen in the emptying atrium, the folder in one hand, his phone in the other, his father's voice from that morning suddenly replaying in his head. I was afraid it had begun to come apart in ways I couldn't fully see from where I sat. He looked up toward the executive elevator, toward the 32nd floor where his father was waiting, and understood, with a cold certainty settling into his chest, that the story he'd just told the entire company wasn't finished. It hadn't even started.